Welcome everybody to our first presentation for Wayne State's International Week. My name is John Brender, and I will be hosting and presenting this session called Cultural Identity and Values, International College Students in the US. And as promised, I will discuss briefly some of my findings on Japanese, Chaldean, and Asian Indian college students. In the future, I promise I will do some more in-depth presentations on each of those and several more. So, not sure why this is, oh, there we go. So being host and presenter, I'm put in the awkward position of making my own immodest introduction. So let me just quickly tell you a little something about myself before we begin so that you have some idea of where I'm coming from, and I promise this will be quick. I'm from Macomb County, which was not a horrible place to grow up. However, by my senior year of high school, I vividly remember thinking there must be more to keeping up lawns and voting down taxes. So I think curiosity has sort of propelled me throughout the years, and as a result, I majored in Spanish. I studied Romance linguistics in graduate school, and I spent about a year in Spain altogether. I spent 2.5 years in Japan altogether. I was director of the Confucius Institute here at Wayne State University for 13 years, in which time I made about 24 trips to China. I have been at the Wayne State University Office of International Programs for the past year, working as director of special initiatives. And just so that you can love me, hate me, and or both, I'm a graduate of both Michigan and Michigan State, which means I bleed turquoise in addition to warrior green. So just a little bit of my research. It's always focused on people who are on the outs, people trying to make a sense of their identity, being some kind of minority, whether it is Americans in China, Japanese college students in the US, Chaldean students in the US, so on and so forth. So that has been my interest over the years, identity, and as you will see, values and how they intersect. Okay, Shangke, that's Chinese for let's get started. Let's get this class started. The topic, so that you know that I know where I'm going. What is identity? What are values? How are values related to identity? And we're going to briefly talk about Japanese, Chaldeans, Asian Indians in the US. Okay, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about why this matters. Okay, question number one. For those of you who are older, you might recognize this rock group, but who are you? Okay, that is my first question. Who? All right, so I'm going to ask everybody to take a minute just to do this kind of mental exercise and fill in the blank. Say, I am blank. Take a minute, think about it. Okay. Hopefully you formulated a few things. So when we talk about identity, okay, some of the things that you may have thought of or written down might include nationality. I am American, I am Indian, I am whatever, Japanese, etc. Maybe region. I'm not just American, I'm a Midwesterner, right? Or I'm a Southerner, or I'm a New Yorker. Ethnic heritage, okay? You might think of, where your people came from, right? I'm Polish American, I am Italian American, African American, so on and so forth. Occupation, a lot of people define themselves. I'm an engineer, I'm a professor, I'm a doctor, that is who I am, right? That can be a very huge identity for many people. Religion, a lot of people define themselves by their religion or maybe their lack thereof. Age, I'm an old person, I'm a young person, right? Middle age, so on and so forth. Physical characteristics, right? I am good looking, I'm not good looking, I'm tall, I'm short, I'm heavy, I'm thin. A lot of people ascribe certain values to that and see physical characteristics as part of their identity. Ability or disability, especially if you have a disability, you may define yourself as being other. You might define yourself as being especially athletic and able, okay, part of your identity. Social class, I'm rich. How many of us would love to say that, right? I'm working class, I'm middle class, right? All part of who we are. So your particular identity, and this is important, consists of a lot of different aspects, right? It's not just that you are American. It's not just that you are Midwestern. It's not just that you are a man, a woman, okay, straight, gay, etc. All of these things come together to make up who you are, okay? Which is probably a good harbinger to let people know that it's stereotypes are not easy, right? Or probably not good at all. So if I say that you are a particular nationality, it doesn't necessarily tell me everything there is to know about you, because there's always much, much more for every person. Okay, some identities may define you more than others, right? For some people, gender identity is all encompassing, and sometimes during certain parts of their lives. The status in the family, I'm the matriarch, I'm the patriarch, I'm the youngest, the oldest, right? Your religion, it might be huge for you. It might not be very important at all. Your ethnicity might be very important. A lot of people are always looking, you know, I'm Jewish, I'm Catholic, and so therefore I am this, right? Occupation, as I mentioned, some people define themselves very strongly by being an engineer, by being a doctor, by being whatever it is they happen to be. And nowadays, especially political affiliation, oftentimes is a huge identity factor for many people. So all of our identities are not really treated equally, right? Some come to the forefront and some are stronger at certain times than others, right? So one way that we can look at our values that are connected to identities are like the controls on a sound or lighting board, right? So let me just give you an example. Let's say that you're Catholic, and as a Catholic, you are pro-life, but you are also a feminist. So you have some other contrasting thoughts. And so that control might be going one way or another, depending on how much you identify with one group or another, okay? And this can happen for lots and lots of things. Identities can change and shift in importance over time and according to situations. So I put a picture of Malcolm X here because I think he's extremely famous for some of his identity shifts, from being sort of a street hood, I think by his own admission, to becoming the leader of a separatist movement, and then going on to Mecca, and then sort of rethinking his ideas. So most of us, hopefully all of us, have some changes and shifts throughout life, and some more profoundly than others. We define ourselves by otherness. So sometimes your identity will come more into play depending on where you are. So with older people, I am something, right? With children, I am maybe more responsible. In Japan, I'm American. I don't wake up every morning saying I'm American or I'm white, but I go to Japan and I look in the mirror and say, right? And I find myself very different. In Spain, I am blank. In Alabama, right? I'm a Northerner, I'm a Yankee, right? So wherever we go, we become aware of being something different, okay? The picture at the bottom, believe it or not, was me about 100 years ago in Japan. All right, what is a value? Okay, I think it's easy enough answer. A value is something that we value, something that we think is important. Something about values is that they're generally on a continuum, okay? So any value, there are extremes in one direction or another. And usually it doesn't really matter a lot. They're just differences, right? So in terms of fitness, you may have very little value for fitness, like the woman on the left, or fitness could be everything, like the woman on the right. Education could be anything from Pink Floyd, who didn't need no education, to Confucius, who seemed to have education permeate every thought he ever had. Time, right? You have Robert Lamb of Chicago. Does anybody really know what time it is? Bill Gates, for whom time is extremely important. A friend of mine met him and said that he walked into the room and there is no small talk with Bill Gates. He's boom, 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 in and out of the room, right? So most of us are somewhere between those two, right? Money. Money could be the root of all evil. You could be Warren Buffett. And religion, you could have on one end, Karl Marx, who said religion is the opiate of the masses, and you could have Gandhi, for whom religion was all important, right? Like I said, most of us fall somewhere along the spectrum, not usually one way or another. All right, values, as I alluded to, are seldom right or wrong, they're often just different, right? How much do you value fitness? How much do you value this, that, or the other? Those are personal choices. They don't affect other people in many respects. However, I would submit, well, let me say something first. People are outraged when values differ from their own, okay? You see people on the right and on the left, and somebody does something that they think is totally normal or to the good, and other people are just disgusted by it, right? So you have outrage on every end of every spectrum, but most values are not necessarily good or bad, just different. However, I would submit bad values hurt or subjugate others, right? So when your value is something like ethnic cleansing or subjugating people based on religion, based on race, based on things of that, then I think one can argue that values are bad. However, people on the other end of that may have other ideas. All right. Foreign values, and I'm sure a lot of people in this audience can relate, they're hard to get used to. When you go to a country where the values are very different from what you were raised with, I guarantee you that you will love and hate some things about that country and getting used to the values. I don't care how liberal or woke or easygoing you think you are. Your emotions will be subject to a lot of differences. And as you see this graph, you will begin to love, hate, and then like, not like, prefer, don't like so much. Oh, this is kind of cool. I'd rather not do this. And you may not get to zero, but you get very used to those values and you begin to accept them over time. Okay. So those of you who've been here in the US, it's okay to hate things for a while, maybe love some things, but you'll get used to things over time. All right, let's connect identity with values. Okay. So for each of your identities, whether it's a cultural identity, a gender identity, a professional identity, and so on, you are going to have different values connected with that particular identity. Today, we're going to focus on cultural identity. Okay. So this handsome man is a Dutch sociologist named Geert Hofstede. And Hofstede came up with an extremely significant study back in 1973, where he looked at people from a multinational company in 40 different countries and provided them with some quantitative studies, asking them about different questions, and then noted that there were very significant differences between countries, and that within countries, those values tended to be consistent, right? And then he spent much of his career writing about theories for why people in Latin America or in Chile may have different values from people in Japan, and so on and so forth, okay? Now, Hofstede's main values are these: power distance, which is how much you accept hierarchy and accept authority and think it's good; uncertainty avoidance, how much you avoid uncertain situations; individualism, I think we understand, how important am I as opposed to the group; and masculinity and competitiveness, which he lists together. Okay, so how competitive are we? How patriarchal is a society, and so on. Here's just a small sampling, and I don't agree with every one of these, especially the ones about China. But you'll notice that, for example, power distance is very high in Brazil and very low in Germany. Individualism, very high in the United States. We can say we're number one when it comes to individualism, right? And it tends to be lower in China, though I would dispute some of that. Masculinity, you'll see different numbers. Uncertainty avoidance. So this is just an example of the idea that people in different countries at a multinational company where we can assume that everybody's a professional and somewhat educated, even so, there are these differences. Okay, now Hofstede used quantitative methods, right? So he's asking 1 through 10, what do you think of this? I tended to use more qualitative methods, so I'm asking people different questions about life and school and family and work and so on in their country, and compare that to the United States and so on and so forth. Okay, I think one, I'm not a quant jock or a qual doll. I think one informs the other. It's important in this area. All right, let's look specifically right now at some things about Japanese values. Okay. This is what I came up with in my dissertation and subsequent book about Japanese identity, and you'll notice that they're polar opposites of US identity. So power distance in Japan is very high. Authority is important. In the US, not so much. Uncertainty avoidance, very high in Japan. They want to know the rules before they have a lot of rules we'll talk about. In the US, we're not so concerned about it. Individualism, well, Japan's a very collectivist country, as many of us can either know or can imagine. In the US, very high individualism. It's about me, 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 right? And then masculinity was kind of a mixed bag. All right, let's talk about power distance. And this is the degree to which people accept differences, okay? I'm not going to give you all of the support that I had in my book, but I'm just going to present you with a couple of arguments. And one is that in the Japanese language is so different from English, so that when you say first person in English, I, is there another way to say I? It's like, I like books. Can you replace I with something? There's really not another word for it, right? And the same thing with you. How are you? I can't think of another how. How is your honor, I suppose, if you're in court. But other than that, we have simply one word for first person singular, one word for second person singular. In Japan, however, I have to take into consideration what my relationship is with the person I'm talking to. Are they older than I am? So I have to be more respectful. Are they younger than I am? In which case, being respectful might get you disrespected, as some young teachers found out. So you really need to assess who you're talking to determine just how to say I and just how to say you. So we can see that it's sort of built in the language. Likewise with verbs, before I can say I write a letter, I need to know to whom I'm writing a letter or who's writing the letter. And that is going to determine the verb that I use in the verb form, right? So I can hardly open my mouth until I understand who my writing is in relation to. And it's always like I write up to, they write down to. There's always an up and a down, agemasu, kuremasu, so on and so forth. Here is a quote that I had from one of the participants in my study, who said, the Japanese language itself separates the class or status level like who I'm actually talking to. Even though I don't want to act differently, the language separates, so I have to act differently. When I speak to older people, I feel like I'm more polite because the language makes me polite, politer than when I'm speaking to younger people, okay? And there are a number of other arguments that I have within my book, but I'm just giving you a sample today. All right, the second part for Japanese is uncertainty avoidance. And this is the degree to which people avoid uncertain situations, okay? And one famous example in Japan is footwear, okay? And this is religiously followed in every home in Japan. I think I'm safe in saying every home in Japan. If you walk into a Japanese home wearing shoes, you will take your shoes, put them in a box or put them aside. You will put on slippers. Slippers will be provided for all guests. You walk into the house in your slippers. If you walk into a tatami room, those woven bamboo mat rooms, you have to take your slippers off and walk in your socks. If you want to go to the bathroom, you put the slippers back on, you walk down the hall. When you get to the bathroom, you take the slippers off, you put on the clogs. They could be wooden, they could be plastic. When you finish going to the bathroom, you take off the clogs, you put on the slippers, you walk back to the tatami room, you take off the slippers, you walk around in your socks or sit. When it's time to leave, you put on slippers again, walk down the hall, take the slippers off, put them in a box, put your shoes on, and then you bow to the host and say, domo, 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 as you walk out backwards in every house in Japan. Okay, obviously we don't follow these kinds of rules, but this is one example of Japanese culture in terms of the rules, and so much of Japanese culture, I would submit, is choreographed. There's a right and wrong thing to say in all situations. So you really need to understand the culture deeply and not just the language. You can translate things, but you need to know when and when you cannot say certain things. Okay, uncertainty avoidance, I had 3 different quotes. One person said, they said like a lot, I thought that was great. Like in the US, nobody's gonna protect you with so many rules like Japan. It's like, wear this, wear that, do like this, do like that. Actually, I think that kind of rule is protecting us, but there's no rule here, referring to the United States. Another said, now that I'm here in the US, Japan is a more peaceful place. It's more structured, so I won't be worried. Right? So there's somebody who really appreciates the uncertainty avoidance. Having those rules, okay, is sort of a prop for what to do. And then another person said, Japan had many rules, but I remember that in the US, they never said like that. In Japan, I always think, why do I need to do it that way? So you have some Japanese students I found who became a little bit more assimilated or more integrated and began to appreciate some of these cultural or value differences that they found here in the US. All right, let's talk about individualism versus collectivism. Here's a quote, which I thought was great. I don't see many American groups get together and pursue one goal or something. It's just, they do their individual work. Like, even if it's group work, they do their part. But to me, it's not really connected to each other. They do like, oh, I did this, or my opinion is this, but it doesn't go really linking to each other. It just feels a little different. I feel really different. The group project in Japan, it's more as a group, but here it's group, but the individual is separated. So think about some of the group projects you may have done in the US. Very often you'll divide up the group and say, okay, you'll do the, you'll crunch the numbers, you're going to do the promotion, you're going to do the writing, and then let's meet again. It's almost like we meet for the shortest possible period of time, go off, do our own thing, and come together. Whereas in Japan, people can actually work together, okay, talking about the same thing. Again, neither is good nor bad, just very different values. My findings on masculinity were a bit more of a mixed bag, and it probably deserves more time at a future date. I'll just mention a couple things like apologies. The Japanese were much more likely to apologize for everything. Everything you did, you just naturally apologized to. In the US, however, those apologies can be a little bit harder to come by. Some people find it extremely hard to apologize, but in Japan, it's almost as natural as breathing. K-12 in Japan was extremely competitive. The US somewhat less so, okay? I could go on and on, but let's suffice it to say that the masculinity really needed to be subdivided to be understood between the US and Japan. Okay, again, these are the final cultural findings. And as you can see, in 3 of the 4, and arguably the 4th of Hofstede's values, the US and Japan were on really opposite ends of the spectrum. So getting used to, for a person from one country to get used to things from the other country, trust me, can be a little bit trying. Okay. All right, let's talk about Chaldeans, okay? Who are the Chaldean people, all right? Just to give you a quick background, they are, according to most, an Assyrian Christian group in Iraq, not identifying as ethnically Arab, okay? Now, there are people who will disagree with that. I've seen people take offense to that, but this tends to be the self-identifier of many Chaldean people. They generally trace their heritage to a few villages in northern Iraq. There's actually a Chaldean rite of the Roman Catholic Church. You can look it up in a Bible and you'll find some reference to that, or at least to the Chaldean people. They speak the language of Jesus called Suret, or it's a modern version of Aramaic. Okay, so that there's a link. And Christians, they're Christians essentially speaking a Semitic language in an Arabic country. So they seem to encapsulate all the cultures of the Middle East all into one. All right, let's look at the findings of Chaldeans. So what we found was collectivism was important, uncertainty avoidance was important. Religion popped up because it just was mentioned so often that it became its own separate value, because many people really define themselves by their Catholic faith, okay? And then of course the masculinity. So I won't belabor all of this, but for example, the collectivism tended to be very family oriented. A lot of families tended to work together, sometimes own stores, sometimes had the same business. Of course, then there were others who were doctors, lawyers, and so on. The uncertainty avoidance were that the parents would encourage the children to take on very practical careers. So if it wasn't law, medicine, or business, it wasn't often very validated, right? So people were sort of seen as, making sure that they were financially secure, right? There was a strong push to preserve elements, okay? A lot of pressure for people to marry for Chaldeans to marry other Chaldeans, right? To restrict dating sometimes as much as possible. As I said, religion seemed to be very, very central to people's identity from the Chaldean community. And then finally, in terms of masculinity, there was a patriarchal society. The men seemed to have an incredible amount of say in the family. The men were seen as sort of macho, strong patriarchs within the family, and they were to provide and come up with money for the family. They're the breadwinners. The women's role was often to take care of the family. Of course, that's changing somewhat with the younger generations. And there was a lot of influence over major and career choices. So a lot of times the parents would say, you need to study this, you need to do this, as opposed to, find your way, okay? So this was sort of a chart that I came up with the Chaldean students that I worked with. And of the four different values, they found collectivism and uncertainty avoidance especially important. So we're talking about people who are Chaldean American, generally born here in the US. And so there's that Chaldean culture at the root, influenced somewhat by American culture. And then we go to the collectivist side, and we see the family name, the face saving is extremely important, or was seen so by participants. Often work for the family, right? A lot of the finances were fluid. They would help each other out to buy a new car, to buy a new wardrobe, things of that sort. Very strong family ties, right? A support of a community. So oftentimes the church was very central for many of the people that we talked to, right? So they were always able to congregate with other Chaldean people. And then on the uncertainty avoidance side, there was a social and financial side. The dating and marriage was extremely important and controlled as an uncertainty avoidance group would find. So we had the close communities, there was a cultural preservation, whether it was through the language, whether it was preserving traditions and so on and so forth. And on the financial side was generally that practical career, finding that law, business, or medicine, right? Those were like the prevailing areas that people tended to go into, right? All right, let's look at the, okay. I asked all of the people that I've worked with, all the participants, to draw pictures that would depict their identity. And this is one I thought that was somewhat interesting. And she says, I'm trying to do what makes me happy, and I'm trying to satisfy what my family would want for me as well. The American culture is just beyond my reach. It's right there and I can get it, but I just have this holding me back, which is why this arrow, Chaldean, is attached to me, and this one, American, is not. Okay, so there's definitely the idea of conflict, right? That she needs to do what the family is expecting, but on the other hand, she feels the Americans pulling her in another direction, but it's not quite as strong as her family. Okay, and I think we're going to see some similarities when we talk about the Asian Indian group. Okay, let's look at the Asian Indian groups, what they call ABCD, okay? And forgive me if I'm stepping outside of my own ethnic group, but I've been assured again by a number of people that the word Desi is used to depict people from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, who sort of identify as sort of that basic Indian culture. And so often within the community, the term ABCD is used, which is an American-born Indian caught between two cultures. ABCDs are seen as neither fully Indian nor fully American. So this is the group that we are getting at. So everybody says ABCD, but not everybody has an immediate definition. So what we were trying to do was to seek, what is that confusion? What are the conflicts for people who identify as ABCD? By the way, there's also ABCDEFG, American-born confused Desi, especially from Gujarat, okay? And then there's the FOBs, the people that they call fresh off the boat, right? There is a TV show by that name for a Chinese immigrant family, but this is generally seen in Indian identity pictures and so on. And this is an Indian who has recently come to the US or who has not assimilated to American culture, right? So we have two very distinct groups within the Indian community. Oops. So there are identity pics, and this one I found really amusing, called Dude, Where's the Party? So you're going to see a lot of conflict between the ABCDs and the FOBs, and you know, where that tension lies. It's kind of a comedy. Kal Penn was in this in his earlier days. If you haven't seen it, I think it's worth seeing. Something I need to mention and qualify is that India is like Europe, okay? India should not be seen as a monolith, and I think a lot of Americans tend to see it that way, but there are really a lot of kind of subgroups within India, people who speak different languages, have some different cultures and traditions and so on. However, for the purposes of this study, everyone who participated, and there were people from various parts of India, all seemed fine to identify with a particular Indian culture. And so that's what we'll talk about. Okay, this is what we came up with for values for Asian Indians. Was collectivism was high, uncertainty avoidance was high, prestige was extremely important in face, religion was important, and so is masculinity. So there's a lot of things that echo the Chaldean community, albeit when we talk about each of these, they can be slightly different. Okay, this I thought, some of the students that I interviewed, I have to say, they could have done stand-up comedy. They were just a joy to talk to, and they had a really interesting and often a healthy way of looking at identity issues. One of the students that I spoke with said, there is no Indian kid I know who would be like, oh, I want to major in pottery. Oh no, they die, laughs. Like, you can major in dance or something if somehow it will lead you to pre-med, but there's no way you could say, oh Dad, I want to be an actor. No, 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 that's unheard of, okay? If you watch the movie Dude, Where's the Party, that kind of thing was addressed, right? The idea that you really need to do something very practical. And it's interesting how many Indian students here, especially ABCDs, are in the medical school, right? And a lot of the FOBs we find in the School of Engineering, but sometimes there's crossover, but those two tend to be the focus of many first and second generation Asian Indian students. A few exceptions, I thought I would just sort of note some of these. Kal Penn, of course, and Frida Pinto, and so on and so forth. But I remember seeing some of the students' reactions. Oh, I cannot imagine how Kal Penn managed to go to UCLA and study sociology. That's just crazy. And then he became an actor and so on. His parents are not like my parents, like any of the people that I know. Collectivism, another quote I thought was interesting. Other Indian families are like, school is life. You have to do well. You have to become a doctor. Then it will look good for your arranged marriage. Then we can get you a better wife if you're a doctor. Okay, so there's often this push, and this is true, I think, of Chinese and Japanese and other groups that I find very collectivist, the parents are really invested in the student's education. They'll often cook and clean and do everything for the student, but it's important that that student do well in high school and college, and that they become prestigious to some degree. Okay. This is the paradigm that we came up with for the ABCD, and I think this is interesting and important. The biggest conflicts for the ABCDs that we spoke to were the choice of major and career and the choice of dating and marriage. And there was a conflict on the collectivism of the Indian side, and often their parents and family, and the individualism of their American friends, of their non-Indian American born friends. And so when it came to major and career, you often had the parents who were saying, you need to respect what I say, you need to listen to what I say, study medicine, study pre-med, so on and so forth. And you have the American friends on the other side saying, dude, you got to do what you want to do. You know, I mean, this is your life. You can't let your parents dominate, right? And especially when it came to dating, and the parents were often set on arranged marriages. And I've seen a number of arranged marriages with ABCDs. And oftentimes they would say, you know, it seems very strange that I'm, you know, allowing my parents to choose a wife for me, a husband for me, but, you know, I've had to trust them in the past, and they've been right, and I'm just going to trust them all the way through. And, you know, it just so happens that, you know, they made a good choice for me. Or when it comes to major, they seemed a little bit apologetic in the sense that, yeah, it's true, my parents pushed me to be pre-med, but it just so happens that I like biology. I really want to become a doctor, right? So there was sort of this rationalization to their American friends, and sometimes even to themselves, as to why they happened to major in what their parents wanted them to major in, become a doctor because their parents wanted them to, or eventually submit to marrying the person that their parents had set up for them. Okay, so so when people talk about ABCD and you say, what exactly does that mean? We have at least one paradigm that we have put together. And then finally, why is any of this important? You know, it's not an exact science to say that every person of one descent or another or one ethnicity is a certain way. As I said, we have multiple identities that inform who we are as individuals. But I think understanding some of these differences and understanding cultural differences can really understand a greater empathy, right? We understand why people are making the decisions that they are. It can certainly lead to greater tolerance and understanding. Once I know where somebody's coming from, I'm a little easier with that, right? Greater self-awareness. I see how some people perceive themselves and how that's different from who I am. And I start to make better sense of myself, of my own identity. And maybe I should move in another direction from what I was raised with here in the American Midwest. And I guarantee you that I have, okay? More harmonious relationships, right? We can get along better when we sort of understand where somebody else is coming from, what their values are. We can lessen conflict. We can increase productivity in the workplace, better arbitrate between people of different cultures. The more we understand of one culture, and I think it's really important to understand one culture different from your own, so that you can then sort of apply that idea of identity and values to other cultures, and then more easily take to different ways of thought, different ways of behavior, different values, and so on and so forth, okay? So that is the bulk of what I have to share with you today.